What if the future of Iran, a country often in the headlines, was already foretold in the Bible? What if Iran's ancient history holds the key to understanding God's plan for the world today? Let's uncover the biblical truth about Iran's destiny and its role in God's story. Iran, known in the Bible as Persia, is far more than a modern political entity. It is a nation with a profound prophetic destiny. From the first mention in Genesis to its crucial role in the prophecies of the end times, Persia's history is intricately woven into God's divine plan for humanity. In this video, we'll dive into Persia's biblical origins, from its rise as an instrument of judgment and restoration to its surprising involvement in the end times. Stay with us to uncover how Iran's story is written in the Bible and what it means for the future of the world. 1. Persia's origins, from Genesis to the nations. The biblical origins of Persia trace back to the descendants of Noah's sons, specifically Madai and Elam, as outlined in Genesis 10:2-4. After the flood, God gave humanity a fresh start, and from the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, came the nations that would populate the earth. The descendants of Madai, one of Japheth's sons, are the ancestors of the Medes, while Elam, a son of Shem, became the father of the Elamites. These two groups, together with other tribes, would eventually form the ancient Persian Empire. Madai's descendants settled in the northern mountainous region of what is now modern-day Iran, known for its rugged terrain and tough, independent people. The Medes, who played an integral role in Persian history, were a major force in the ancient Near East. Similarly, the Elamites, who lived in the southwestern part of Iran, near the Persian Gulf, established one of the earliest civilizations in the region. Their first significant biblical mention is in Genesis 14, where they are involved in a great battle that saw Abraham's intervention and victory. In this pivotal moment, Abraham defeats the Elamite kings and their allies, showing that no earthly power, not even Persia's forebears, could prevail against God's chosen people. While Persia's ancestors initially stood in opposition to God's people, their eventual rise plays a key role in the divine plan for Israel. This encounter underscores the timeless truth that God's sovereignty over all nations is never in doubt. Even in moments of conflict, God's overarching purpose remains. Understanding Persia's origins is crucial for interpreting its future role in the biblical narrative. These early genealogies in Genesis reveal that Persia's destiny was always intertwined with God's purposes for humanity. While the Persian Empire would rise as a powerful force in the world, it was ultimately chosen by God to fulfill a unique mission, first in judgment and later in redemption. God's ability to use nations, even those outside his direct covenant, to accomplish his will is a powerful reminder that his plans extend beyond borders, transcending human limitations. In the grand scheme of God's providence, Persia's establishment in the biblical story serves to demonstrate that no matter how powerful or insignificant a nation might seem, God is at work through all of them. The early chapters of Genesis lay the groundwork for understanding not only Persia's origins, but also its crucial place in God's unfolding narrative. As we continue to explore Persia's role, we'll see that even as it rises and falls, it remains part of God's larger plan to bring salvation to his people. This history is also a profound reminder for us today. Just as Persia was part of God's plan thousands of years ago, every nation, including our own, plays a part in the unfolding story of redemption. God's sovereignty governs all human history, past, present, and future. He can take even the most unlikely candidates and use them for his greater purposes. So as we witness world events unfold, we can take comfort in knowing that God is still in control, working all things together according to his divine will. Persia's origins also remind us of the importance of understanding where we come from, both as individuals and as nations. Just as Madai and Elam's descendants shape the future of Persia, our own past shapes our present and our future. And just as Persia had a divinely ordained role in God's redemptive plan, so too do we have a purpose in God's greater narrative. Let us reflect on how God is at work in our lives, and how our actions today may have a ripple effect in his eternal plan. 2. Persia's first encounter with God's people. The battle in Genesis. In Genesis 14, we encounter one of the first and most significant biblical interactions involving Persia's forebears, the Elamites. This event, which occurs long before the rise of the Persian Empire, sets the stage for understanding Persia's future role in God's divine plan. At this time, the Elamites were powerful and influential, forming part of a coalition of kings who launched a military campaign against the cities of the Jordan Valley. Among the cities they attacked was Sodom, and during their conquest, they captured Lot, the nephew of Abraham. Abraham, demonstrating great courage and faith, gathered a small group of his own trained men, only 318 in total, and pursued the invading kings. He attacked them by night, catching them off guard, and won an improbable victory. Not only did he rescue his nephew Lot, but he also freed the captives and reclaimed the spoils taken by the invaders. This victory, achieved against overwhelming odds, was a powerful demonstration of God's favor on Abraham and his protection over his people. What's especially significant here is that the Elamites, who were direct ancestors of the Persian people, are shown as enemies of God's chosen family. Despite this, God chose to work through them, setting the stage for their later role in the restoration of Israel. While the initial conflict shows that Persia's ancestors stood in opposition to God's people, this story also reveals a crucial truth: God is sovereign, and even nations that seem to be opposed to him are ultimately under his control. In this battle, we see that God's will is not determined by human strength or political power, but by his divine purpose. This conflict also highlights a timeless biblical principle. No earthly kingdom or ruler can ultimately succeed against God's will. Abraham's victory was not just a military success, but a spiritual declaration. God had made a promise to Abraham that his descendants would be a great nation, and that promise was secure despite the seemingly insurmountable odds. The Elamites may have been a threat at that moment, but their eventual role in the biblical story would be entirely different, as God would later use Persia for his own redemptive purposes. Furthermore, this event sets a precedent for how God uses both nations and individuals to accomplish his will. The Elamites were not a part of Israel's covenant, yet their rise and eventual participation in God's plan for Israel's redemption were clearly foreordained. This reminds us that God's plan includes all nations, even those that seem far removed from his purposes. For us today, this story calls us to reflect on the ways God may be working through even the most unlikely sources to accomplish his purposes in our lives and in the world. Just as God used the Elamites in a battle against Abraham, he can use the conflicts and challenges we face as part of his greater plan for our lives. Even in the midst of adversity, we must trust that God is at work, shaping history according to his will. In the same way, Persia's future involvement in God's redemptive story was set in motion through a moment of conflict, showing that God can work through any situation, no matter how complex or difficult. The story of Abraham's victory over the Elamites is also a powerful reminder that God's plan for Israel, and for us, remains secure, even in times of trial. Like Abraham, we may face enemies or circumstances that seem insurmountable, but as long as we remain faithful to God, his purposes will prevail. We are reminded that the forces of evil, no matter how powerful they appear, are ultimately under God's sovereign control. This passage is also a call to reflect on how God uses both the victories and challenges in our lives to accomplish his greater purposes. While we may not understand the full scope of God's plan, we can take comfort in knowing that just as he worked through Abraham's faith, he is at work in our lives, guiding us through our own battles toward the fulfillment of his promises. 3. The prophecy of judgment and restoration. Isaiah and Jeremiah's vision. The prophets. Isaiah and Jeremiah provide us with a glimpse into Persia's crucial role in the biblical narrative, both in judgment and in restoration. In Isaiah 44:28, God declares that he will use a future Persian king, Cyrus, to bring about the downfall of Babylon, the nation that had destroyed Jerusalem and its temple. This prophecy, spoken long before Cyrus was born, demonstrates God's sovereignty over the nations and his control over history. God had already planned to use Persia, a nation outside of Israel's covenant, as an instrument of divine judgment against Babylon. This prophecy is striking because God specifically names Cyrus as his chosen agent, calling him my shepherd in Isaiah 44:28, even though Cyrus was a pagan king. This is a powerful reminder that God is not limited by human understanding or boundaries. He can use anyone, whether they know him or not, to fulfill his divine will. Cyrus would be used to bring Israel back from exile, rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and restore God's people, even though he was not part of God's covenant. Jeremiah also speaks of Persia's role in judgment, predicting the fall of Babylon to the Medes and Persians in Jeremiah 51:11-12. Babylon's judgment was necessary because of its oppression of God's people, but Persia's rise was divinely ordained. As Persia's power grew, it became the instrument of God's justice, fulfilling the prophecies made by Isaiah and Jeremiah. The conquest of Babylon by the Persians and the subsequent release of the Jewish people from captivity marked a pivotal moment in biblical history, demonstrating that God's plan would be fulfilled through unexpected means. God's use of Persia as an instrument of judgment also reveals his larger purpose. He is sovereign over all the nations, and he alone determines the rise and fall of empires. Persia's ascent to power, while initially a means of judgment against Babylon, would also pave the way for Israel's restoration. This complex role of judgment and restoration shows the depth of God's plans for the nations. For us today, these prophecies speak to the way God works in ways we might not always understand. Just as God used Persia to bring judgment on Babylon, he often uses circumstances in our lives, both good and bad, to fulfill his greater purposes. Even when we face trials or experience hardship, we must trust that God is in control and working all things together for our good, just as he worked through Persia's rise and fall to restore Israel. The restoration of Israel through Persia also offers hope. God used a foreign pagan king to fulfill his promise to Israel. This shows us that God's redemption is not limited by our circumstances or by the tools he chooses to use. If God can use Cyrus to restore Israel, he can use any situation in our lives for his glory and for the fulfillment of his promises. This is a reminder that no situation, no matter how unlikely it seems, is beyond God's ability to transform and use for his divine purposes. In our own lives, we must learn to trust God's timing and his ability to use even the most unexpected people or situations to accomplish his will. The story of Persia's role in the judgment and restoration of Israel teaches us that God's plan for redemption is bigger than we can imagine, and that his ways are often mysterious but always perfect. The story of Persia's prophetic role reminds us that God's purpose for the world and his people transcends borders, nations, and rulers. Even when the world seems chaotic, we can trust that God is at work, using all things, even those we least expect, to bring about his redemptive plan. Through Persia, God showed that his sovereignty rules over all, and that he is always at work, bringing his promises to fulfillment, even when we cannot see how. 4. The rise of Persia and the role of King Cyrus. The rise of the Persian Empire is a pivotal moment in biblical history, particularly in the context of God's plan for Israel. The prophecy that God would use a foreign king, Cyrus, to fulfill his purposes is revealed in Isaiah 45:1. Remarkably, God refers to Cyrus as my anointed, a title usually reserved for Israel's kings or priests. This designation highlights the surprising and significant role that Cyrus, a pagan king, would play in the restoration of God's people. Cyrus was not a believer in the God of Israel, yet God chose him to carry out a divine task that no one expected, a task that would fulfill a centuries-old prophecy. Cyrus, the ruler of the Medo-Persian Empire, was not only a military genius but also a visionary leader. After uniting the Medes and Persians, he expanded his empire to become one of the largest the world had ever seen. His conquests, though often brutal, also included policies that allowed for religious freedom and the return of exiled peoples to their homelands. When Cyrus defeated Babylon, he was faced with the Jewish exiles who had been held captive for over 70 years. In a move that was nothing short of miraculous, he issued a decree that allowed the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. In Ezra 1:1-4, we read that Cyrus's decree was not merely a political decision, it was God's will in action. This decree marked the fulfillment of God's promise to his people that they would be restored to their land. The rebuilding of the temple was a symbol of the renewed relationship between God and Israel, and Cyrus played a key role in facilitating that process. Though Cyrus did not acknowledge the God of Israel, his actions were in perfect alignment with God's plan. This is a profound reminder that God can use anyone, even those outside of his covenant, to accomplish his will. Cyrus's decree also represents an important lesson for us today. God's purposes are not dependent on our understanding or our preferences. Sometimes God uses people, situations, or decisions that seem unlikely to us, but in his sovereignty, he brings about his perfect will. Cyrus was not a believer, yet he was chosen by God to fulfill a vital part of the redemptive story. This teaches us that God's power is not limited by human boundaries, and he can work through anyone to accomplish his divine purposes. The spiritual significance of Cyrus's role in Israel's restoration goes beyond the rebuilding of the physical temple. It was also about the restoration of the worship of God and the renewal of Israel's covenantal relationship with him. The decree allowed for the Jewish people to return to the land promised to their ancestors, and in doing so they were able to reinstate the worship of God in Jerusalem. This was a profound act of grace, as God chose to work through a foreign king to bring about his redemptive purposes. For us, the story of Cyrus calls us to reflect on the way God works in our lives. Just as Cyrus was a key figure in the restoration of Israel, there may be people or circumstances in our lives that, at first glance, seem to be outside of God's plan for us. Yet just as God used Cyrus, he can use anyone and anything for his glory. This story reminds us that God's ways are higher than ours and that his timing is always perfect. Cyrus's decree also offers a powerful message of hope. It shows that no matter how dark our circumstances may seem, God is always at work, fulfilling his promises and preparing a way for his people. Just as he used Cyrus to restore Israel, he can bring restoration in our own lives. Even when we do not understand how God is working, we can trust that he is faithful to fulfill his promises and to bring about his perfect plan for us. As we reflect on the role of Cyrus in biblical history, let us be encouraged by the fact that God is in control, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. His plan is never thwarted, and his will is always accomplished. Let this story remind us that God's redemptive purposes extend far beyond what we can see, and that his power and sovereignty are unmatched. We can trust in God's divine plan, knowing that he is always at work for our good and his glory. 5. Daniel's vision, the fall of Babylon and the rise of Persia. The book of Daniel offers a prophetic look into the future, detailing not only the fall of Babylon, but also the rise of Persia as the dominant empire. Daniel, a Jewish exile living in Babylon, was chosen by God to interpret visions that would reveal the course of world history and God's ultimate plan for his people. These visions were given to Daniel at a time when Babylon was at its peak, but God revealed that this mighty empire would soon fall and be replaced by another, the Persian Empire. In Daniel 2, King Nebuchadnezzar, troubled by a dream of a statue made of different metals, summoned his wise men to interpret it. The statue had a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, a belly and thighs of bronze, and legs of iron with feet of clay. Daniel, empowered by God, revealed that the statue represented successive empires, Babylon as the head of gold, followed by an inferior kingdom, symbolized by the silver chest and arms. This was Persia. God showed Daniel that the Persian Empire would overthrow Babylon, and this prophecy came to pass with stunning accuracy. The silver chest and arms represented not just the Medes and the Persians, but the dual nature of their alliance. Despite the Medes' involvement, it was Persia that would eventually dominate. This rise of Persia was not just a political shift, it was part of God's divine plan to bring judgment upon Babylon and restore his people. In Daniel 7, God gives Daniel another vision of 4 beasts, each representing a different empire. The second beast is described as a bear raised up on one side, which again symbolizes the Medo-Persian Empire. The bear's asymmetry reflects the greater strength of Persia over the Medes. This vision further emphasizes Persia's dominance in the ancient world, which would eventually lead to its conquest of Babylon. The prophecy was not only a declaration of Persia's rise, but it also showed the broader scope of God's sovereign rule over the nations. Persia's victory over Babylon was a fulfillment of God's judgment against a nation that had oppressed his people. But it was also part of the larger redemptive plan. Persia would play a role in restoring Israel by allowing the Jewish people to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple. Daniel's visions also highlight an important theological principle. God is sovereign over history. Even in the midst of oppressive kingdoms and empires that seem to hold all power, God's will prevails. He raises up rulers and kingdoms for his purposes, even when they don't know or acknowledge him. In the case of Persia, God used a pagan king, Cyrus the Great, to accomplish his will, demonstrating that no earthly power can thwart God's plan. For us today, the story of Daniel's vision calls us to trust in God's sovereignty, especially in times of uncertainty. While we may not understand the political or social shifts happening around us, we can trust that God is in control. Just as he used Persia to fulfill his plan, he is at work in our lives and in the world, shaping history according to his will. Daniel's visions also serve as a reminder that God's timing is perfect. The rise and fall of empires are not random or accidental, but are part of a larger divine narrative. Persia's ascent and Babylon's fall were not just historical events. They were a fulfillment of God's prophecy, demonstrating that God is always working behind the scenes, fulfilling his promises to his people. Finally, Daniel's prophetic revelations remind us that God's plans are not limited by human understanding. He often works in unexpected ways and uses unexpected people and nations to bring about his purposes. The rise of Persia and the fall of Babylon were a divine plan in motion, orchestrated by God's perfect wisdom. This should give us confidence that no matter what challenges we face, God's plan for our lives is always moving forward, and his purpose will be fulfilled. 6. Persia's role in deliverance, Esther, and the saving of Israel. The book of Esther presents a remarkable story of divine intervention, where Persia, once an enemy of Israel, becomes the vehicle through which God saves his people. The story takes place during the reign of King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes I of Persia, a powerful and influential empire that ruled much of the ancient world. Esther, a Jewish woman, becomes the queen of Persia, setting the stage for an extraordinary act of salvation. In Esther 4:14, Mordecai, Esther's cousin, challenges her to act when a plot to destroy the Jewish people arises within the Persian court. Haman, an influential advisor to the king, has devised a plan to annihilate all Jews in the Persian Empire, driven by his pride and hatred for Mordecai. Despite being queen, Esther is reluctant to approach the king uninvited, as doing so could result in her death. However, Mordecai reminds her that her position as queen might be divinely ordained for such a time as this. Esther courageously steps forward, risking her life to expose Haman's plot. She invites the king and Haman to 2 banquets, during which she reveals her Jewish identity and exposes Haman's treachery. The king, enraged by Haman's deceit, orders his execution, and the Jews are granted the right to defend themselves. This turn of events leads to a great victory for Israel and the preservation of God's people within Persia's domain. The story of Esther is a powerful testament to God's providence. While God's name is never mentioned in the book, his hand is evident in every detail. Esther, a Jewish orphan, rose to become queen, and God placed her in this position for the very purpose of saving her people. This reminds us that God's plan is always at work, even when we don't immediately see his presence. Just as he used Esther's courage and influence, he can use anyone in any circumstance to accomplish his divine will. Moreover, this story reveals a crucial truth about God's sovereignty. He can use the secular and the unexpected to bring about his plans for his people. Persia, an empire that was not part of the covenant God had made with Israel, becomes the very instrument through which God's promise of deliverance is fulfilled. This teaches us that God's plans transcend our human understanding. Even nations and individuals who seem distant from his purpose can be used to fulfill his greater work. For us, the story of Esther offers profound spiritual lessons. First, it reminds us that God has placed each of us in a unique position for a specific purpose. Just as Esther was chosen to be queen for such a time as this, we too have roles to play in God's kingdom. We must be willing to step out in faith, trusting that God will equip us for the tasks He calls us to. Second, the story of Esther teaches us about the power of courage and faith. In the face of great danger, Esther trusted in God's protection and acted, knowing that her life was in His hands. This story encourages us to trust God's timing and step forward in faith, even when the odds seem impossible. Finally, the story of Esther is a reminder that God's deliverance is not just for Israel, but for all His people. Through Esther, God shows that He cares for His people, even in foreign lands, and His plans for salvation extend beyond the boundaries of Israel. In our own lives, this reinforces the truth that God's plan for redemption includes all of us. His deliverance is available to anyone who trusts in Him, no matter their background or situation. Esther's story reminds us of God's ongoing work in the world. Even today, He continues to orchestrate events for His purposes, using unexpected people and situations to bring about His will. The courage of Esther and the deliverance of God's people serve as a powerful reminder of the faithfulness of God to His promises and His sovereign control over all things. Just as He delivered Israel through Esther, He is still at work today, bringing His people through trials and into His victory. 7. The Magi and Persia's role in recognizing the Messiah. In the Gospel of Matthew, we read a fascinating story about a group of wise men known as the Magi, who traveled from the east to worship the newborn King of the Jews. This moment, which we often associate with the Christmas story, holds deep significance not only for the arrival of Jesus, but also for the role of Persia in God's redemptive plan. The Magi were likely from the ancient lands of Persia, or modern-day Iran, a connection that is often overlooked. These men were learned astronomers and spiritual leaders, deeply entrenched in the study of the stars and the prophecies of the ancient world. It's highly probable that the Magi were familiar with the Hebrew scriptures, particularly the prophecies of Daniel, who had served in the courts of Babylon and Persia centuries earlier. Daniel's writings, including his prophetic insights about the coming Messiah, were likely known to the Magi, influencing their understanding of the significance of the star they saw in the sky. The star that guided the Magi was not a mere astronomical phenomenon, but a divine sign that pointed them to the birth of the Messiah. The Magi's journey symbolizes how God's message of salvation extends beyond Israel. Though they were from a nation not part of the covenant, they recognized the signs and responded in faith. Their journey to Bethlehem, bearing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, fulfilled an important biblical prophecy and was a prophetic acknowledgement that Jesus was not just a king for Israel, but the king of all nations. This moment underscores God's inclusive plan for salvation, showing that the Messiah's arrival was not limited to Israel, but was meant for the whole world. The Magi's recognition of Jesus as the king exemplifies how God works beyond human boundaries. He revealed His plan to those outside of Israel, demonstrating that His message of hope, redemption, and peace is for everyone, Jew, Gentile, and all nations. Their response to the star was a declaration that God's salvation was not confined to the people of Israel, but extended to all the nations of the world. The spiritual significance of this moment is profound. The gifts the Magi presented to Jesus, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, were symbolic in their own right. Gold represented Jesus' kingship, recognizing Him as the rightful ruler of the world. Frankincense, used in incense for worship, symbolized His divinity and the recognition that He is worthy of worship. Myrrh, often used in embalming, foreshadowed His death and sacrifice for the sins of humanity. These gifts were more than ceremonial offerings. They prophetically pointed to Jesus' identity as both King and Savior, who would rule and ultimately give His life for the world. For us today, the Magi's journey offers a powerful lesson in spiritual discernment and obedience. Even though the Magi were not part of Israel, they recognized the significance of the star and understood its connection to the Messiah. Their willingness to follow the star, no matter the distance or the challenges, is a testament to the importance of responding to God's revelations, no matter how they come. Just as the Magi traveled far to find Jesus, we too are called to follow God's signs and seek His truth wherever it leads. The story of the Magi also highlights how God can use individuals from any background to fulfill his purposes. The Magi were not part of Israel's religious heritage, but God used them to bear witness to the truth of Christ's birth. This reminds us that God's kingdom is vast and inclusive, and his grace reaches beyond the boundaries we often place on it. The Magi's visit also calls us to recognize Jesus for who he truly is. Just as they brought their best gifts to honor him, we too are called to bring our best to God in worship, acknowledging him as the King and Savior of the world. Their recognition of Jesus as the Messiah is a powerful reminder that Jesus came not just for Israel, but for the entire world. In the same way, we are called to embrace Jesus as the Savior of all people and to share the good news of his birth, life, death, and resurrection with the world around us. In conclusion, the Magi's journey demonstrates how Persia, an empire far from Israel, played a vital role in the story of salvation. Their recognition of the Messiah marks a significant moment in the biblical narrative, showing that God's plan is universal and that the message of salvation is for all nations. As we reflect on the Magi's visit, let it remind us to seek Christ with the same dedication and reverence, and to recognize his reign in our lives. 8. Persia in the End Times. Prophecies of Gog and Magog. The biblical role of Persia, which once helped Israel return from exile, takes a more ominous turn in the prophetic visions of the end times. One of the most significant prophetic passages involving Persia is found in Ezekiel 38-39, where the prophet describes a future coalition of nations that will rise up against Israel in the last days. Among these nations is Persia, which is often understood to refer to modern-day Iran. In Ezekiel 38:1-6, God warns of a great invasion that will come from the north, led by a powerful figure referred to as Gog, the leader of Magog. This alliance of nations includes Persia, along with others like Cush, modern-day Sudan, Put, likely Libya, and Gomer, regions near Turkey. The prophecy depicts these nations as banding together in a final climactic battle against Israel. This war of Gog and Magog is a pivotal moment in the Bible's eschatological narrative. It's often associated with the final battle in the end times, where the forces of evil will gather against God's people. The prophecy suggests that Persia, which once played a key role in the restoration of Israel, will later stand against Israel in opposition, joining forces with other nations to wage war. The spiritual significance of this prophecy is profound. While Persia was once an instrument of God's redemption, it now represents the complexities of divine judgment. This shift from being a deliverer of Israel to an adversary reflects the dual nature of God's relationship with nations. He can use even those who oppose him for his purposes. The passage reminds us of God's sovereignty over the affairs of nations, showing that no one, no matter how great or powerful, can escape his judgment if they choose to act against his will. In Ezekiel 38:8, God speaks of these nations rising against Israel after a period of peace and restoration. This reflects the tension in the world today as Israel, which has been restored as a nation, faces continued opposition. The prophetic nature of this text points to the way global events may align with biblical prophecies, especially as tensions in the Middle East continue to grow. This prophecy of Persia in the end times teaches us an important spiritual lesson. We must be vigilant. The Bible calls us to stay awake, to watch for the signs of the times, and to be ready for the fulfillment of God's promises. While we don't know when or how these events will unfold, we are reminded that God's ultimate victory is assured. Despite the rise of nations that may oppose him, he will stand in defense of his people. For believers, this prophecy also serves as a call to prayer and spiritual preparation. Just as Israel in the Old Testament faced external threats, so too will God's people in the last days. But the Bible assures us that God will intervene on behalf of Israel, as he has done throughout history. In Ezekiel 38:22-23, God promises to pour out his wrath upon those who come against his people, bringing about a dramatic reversal. This reminds us that, although we may face challenges or opposition in the world, God is always in control, and his justice will prevail. In addition, the prophecy of Gog and Magog challenges us to consider the nature of spiritual warfare. While the passage is about a physical battle, it is also symbolic of the spiritual battles that believers face today. The forces of evil are constantly at work, but we are reminded that God's ultimate victory over sin and death has already been won through Jesus Christ. We can stand firm in faith, knowing that the final defeat of all evil is assured. For us, this passage also offers hope. Despite the overwhelming forces that may rise up against us, we know that God is faithful and that His promises will be fulfilled. Just as He once used Persia for good and will bring judgment upon them in the end times, God's plan for redemption is ultimately about restoring all things to Himself. His judgment is always just, and His grace is always available. In conclusion, the prophecy of Persia in the end times in Ezekiel 38-39 challenges us to reflect on the larger narrative of God's sovereignty, justice, and redemption. It's a reminder that even nations that stand against God are part of His plan, and that His ultimate victory will bring peace and restoration to His people. As we await the fulfillment of these prophecies, we are called to trust in God's control over history and to remain faithful as we witness His plan unfold. 9. The ultimate destiny of Persia, judgment and hope. In the final chapters of Ezekiel, after the dramatic portrayal of the Battle of Gog and Magog, we see the judgment of Persia, a nation once used by God for the restoration of Israel. In Ezekiel 38-39, we learn that Persia, along with other nations, will be part of an alliance that rises against Israel in the end times. However, this isn't the end of Persia's story. God, in His infinite wisdom and mercy, offers a glimpse of hope even in the midst of judgment. In Ezekiel 39:1-2, God declares that He will bring Persia and its allies to account for their opposition to Israel. This judgment will be harsh and swift, marking a time of reckoning for those who align themselves against God's chosen people. But even in the context of judgment, God's character remains consistent. He is just, but He is also merciful. After the judgment comes an unexpected promise. In Jeremiah 49:39, God promises that despite Persia's judgment, there will be a day when He will restore the captives of Elam, referring to the ancient Persian region. This is a stunning revelation. Even though Persia will be part of the final battle against Israel, God in His grace will leave the door open for their eventual restoration. This prophecy signals that even in the midst of His righteous judgment, God's ultimate plan includes redemption. Persia, like many other nations, will have the opportunity for repentance and reconciliation with God. This dual nature of judgment and restoration is a central theme in the Bible. God's judgment is always just, and He will not allow evil to go unpunished. Yet His heart is always open to those who repent. Persia's story shows that no nation or people is beyond God's grace, and no matter how far they may have fallen, God's door of mercy remains open to those who turn back to Him. For believers today, this offers both a challenge and a hope. The challenge is clear. We must recognize the seriousness of God's judgment. Nations, just like individuals, will face consequences for their actions. In the end, those who oppose God's will be held accountable. But the hope is equally powerful. God's grace is available even to those who seem farthest from Him. Just as He offers restoration to Persia, He offers it to us. No matter how far we may have strayed, God is always ready to forgive and restore us when we turn back to Him. This dual message of judgment and hope underscores the importance of spiritual vigilance. The world around us may seem to be filled with conflict, injustice, and opposition to God's will, but we must remember that God is in control. The story of Persia's ultimate fate reminds us that history is moving toward a final reckoning, where God will judge the nations, but also extend mercy to those who seek His forgiveness. This is the hope of the gospel, the promise that even in the face of judgment, God offers redemption. As believers, we are called to live in light of this hope, trusting that God's purposes will ultimately prevail. Even as the world around us seems uncertain, we can take comfort in the fact that God's plan is unfolding perfectly. Persia's journey from a nation used for Israel's restoration to one that will stand against God's people in the end times, and then be offered restoration again, shows the complexity of God's redemptive plan. It's a reminder that God's ways are higher than ours, and that His justice and mercy work together in ways we may not fully understand, but can trust with all our hearts. In the end, the story of Persia's judgment and restoration offers us a model for how we should live today. We are called to be vigilant, faithful, and ever aware of God's sovereignty over history. At the same time, we are reminded of the power of repentance and the boundless grace of God, who offers restoration to all who turn to Him. Persia's ultimate fate, like our own, rests in God's hands, and His hands are both just and merciful. We can trust Him to bring about His will, even when it seems beyond our comprehension. Conclusion. The story of Persia in the Bible is a profound and complex one, woven with themes of judgment, restoration, and divine sovereignty. From its ancient origins in Genesis to its role in the end times as prophesied in Ezekiel, Persia, now modern-day Iran, has played a pivotal part in God's unfolding plan for humanity. At one point, Persia was an instrument of Israel's restoration, used by God to fulfill His promises and bring His people back to their land. Yet, as we approach the final chapters of history, Persia is also seen as a key player in the end times, joining forces with other nations in the battle of Gog and Magog against Israel. But even in the midst of judgment, God's mercy shines through. The prophecies of restoration for Persia remind us that no nation is beyond redemption, and God's grace is always available to those who turn to Him. This dual nature of God's judgment and mercy speaks to the heart of His redemptive plan for all nations, including our own. As we reflect on Persia's biblical destiny, we are called to trust in God's sovereign control over history. We must recognize that His plan is being fulfilled before our eyes, and that He can use even the most unlikely sources to accomplish His will. But we are also reminded that, as God's people, we must remain vigilant in faith, prepared for the challenges and trials that lie ahead. We are called to trust in God's timing, knowing that His promises will be fulfilled, even when we don't fully understand how or when. In the end, Persia's story is our story. It's a story of redemption, of judgment, and of hope. A story that reminds us that God's grace extends far beyond what we can comprehend, offering restoration even in the darkest moments. As we look to the future, let us hold on to the promise that, though judgment is certain, God's redemption is available to all who turn to Him in repentance and faith. His sovereign plan is being worked out, and we are part of it. So, as we watch world events unfold and witness the nations rising and falling, let us remember that God is in control, and His plan will always prevail. May we, like the Magi, seek the truth and follow the path of righteousness, trusting in the God who holds the future in His hands.